Hey, brothers and sisters. I got a question on my channel here recently, and it was just more or less reminded me of a short video I wanted to do on allegory in the Bible. So this isn't really an answer to the person that left the uh, message on one of my videos here about a possible allegory in the Bible. It's more of how do allegories work in the Bible, and I'll leave it to that person to connect up and study that and see what they think. So I'm not trying to dodge a bullet. It's just when somebody brings an allegory to you, I want to just kind of go through how do the allegories work in the Bible, and then everybody can make that application as the Lord leads. So that's my thought here. Now I did a quick video on allegories already in I got a section about understanding Bible prophecy, a little playlist. I'll probably just add this to it because I'm going to cover a little bit more additional information here that I probably didn't have in that last video. I want to cover there's really a couple of types of allegories that are prevalent in the Bible, especially when you look at prophetic use of allegory in the Bible. There's, kind of two, and one's more prevalent. So let's take a look at the more prevalent version and go through an example or two here, and then we'll look at uh, I'd say the least prevalent one, and that will be the additional information here. So I'm jumping over Genesis 25 here in Bible Gateway, and then we're going to look at Genesis 25 and Esther just as examples of the more prevalent use of um, allegory in the Bible. And so what do we have here? These set of examples that we're going to have is something called historical narrative in the Bible. It's just a recounting of the actual history of the people and places in Old Testament times. Here are my examples in the Bible. And what is the allegory then? Well, the allegory isn't the plain meaning of these passages. It's the pattern that the passages set up. And so incremental to the plain meaning, you can get um, an allegorical usage. And what happens here is that the plain meaning, the events actually happened, but they set up types, and the types are ordered in a certain order that show a pattern that becomes then the allegory. And again, if you're unfamiliar with the language of types or the meaning with allegory, go to my playlist on understanding Bible prophecy, and I go through that. I want to more just focus on these examples so that we can, set this out there and hopefully clear up how do these allegories work in the Bible. So here we got in Genesis 25 the story of Isaac and his wife Rebecca, and a real interesting um, allegory that uh, Rabbi Ben Danoon, or Rabbi Danoon, um, is now getting fairly famous for having pulled out. So let me just read this here. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padanaram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him. And Rebekah his wife conceived, and the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And so um, now what Rabbi Brother Danoon said is specifically because we're sort of getting pointed there by what God told her, is that the two nations represented in the womb um, were Esau and Jacob, right? That we learned that a little bit later. But the two nations then probably being Esau's descendants, which um, would be what's known in the Bible as the Edomites, but um, down through time, the migration of the Edomites into the areas that now are the Palestinians. Now, Palestinians are a mixed group, but they have representation of the Edomites. And so what we're getting here is, the older, the one that came out first, Esau, would serve the younger, and the younger being Jacob, later to be named Israel. So the two nations then are the Palestinians and the Israelites. So I chose this one specifically because, boy, it would be hard to pluck out um, that the this birth that Rebecca had could have been used as a allegory of two nations, but we're told that we can do that right here by God Himself. And so I chose this so you see how it happens. Isaac was real, and at 40 years old, he really did have a wife, Rebecca, who really was the daughter. And you can see this is historical narrative because it's very plain. It isn't symbolic language. It isn't like parable kind of language. This is just a historical narrative. A real person at a specific age had a real wife, and who was the specific daughter of certain people who we go through conceived and had the twins in her and the like. And so the pattern that was set was actually given to us by God. So this is about the easiest version of this allegory sitting on top of a historical narrative that I've heard so far. Now, one that, and I'm just using Rabbi Danu's two examples, I'll give you a few more. Another one that he brought forward that I think is pretty cool is he talked about here in the book of Esther, King Ahasuerus had his first wife Vashti, and Vashti was the queen before the king with a royal crown. And she was summoned to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look at. But the queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Then the king said to the wise men which knew the times, for so the king's manner toward all that knew the law and judgment. And then I won't read it all the way down, but then they come up with the fact that King Ahasuerus should give a decree that the wives should be subject unto their husbands, and then next they sent a search out into all the provinces to look for a wife to basically replace Vashti, and that's where Esther comes into the story. Now, Brother Danoon just makes it a lot more clear now. These are actual events. Again, there really was a Queen Vashti. There really was a King Ahasuerus. This is a historical narrative, and it does set up a type. So the king called for his wife, and his wife refused to come. And the wife was being called to come by seven, I think it was, chamberlains or princes, and she refused. And so the king basically set her aside and made a search out while he decreed a law that they should be subject to their husbands. And then he set a search out to find his wife Esther. And now Brother Danoon shows that there's an obvious kind of a allegory in here where King Ahasuerus is a type of God, and Vashti is a type of the first bride, which was that language was used in the Old Testament of the Israelite people being referred to as basically the bride or wife of God, because they were the chosen people. And when the prophets were sent and they were refused to come, and the Israelites refused to stay. He uses the words in the Old Testament of harlotry quite often. Then they were set aside, which, pattern-wise fits what happened here when Christ was rejected. And then the search went out, and a new bride, Esther, was chosen, and that would be the allegory of the search going out, and for the church being gathered as the bride of Christ. So that's the actual events, real people, actual history, but it set up a pattern for how God thought of Israel and how Israel was then set aside when Israel rejected to come to him. Then God sent out a search and gathered the church out of the nations to be his bride. And we know God returns now to the people of Israel as well. And so this is how allegories work in general. And a few others you can consider, when Abraham was told to take Isaac, at the time his only son, to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him, and then at the last minute there was a substitution of the goat that was caught in the thicket. A substitutionary death was performed, the slaying. And then if you follow through the rest of that story, several more chapters later, all of a sudden, one of Isaac's servants is sent to his home country to pick out a bride for him. And there you see, not only the substitutionary death of Christ on Mount Moriah, but you see the Holy Spirit drawing a bride for Christ in the role of that servant. And I'll leave you to go dig that out. But that's how most allegories work in the Bible. Actual historical narrative, real events, they took place, but yet they set and establish a pattern. Book of Ruth, the whole book is basically another allegory of the kinsman redeemer, and you can go dig that one out. I've done videos on that one. But Boaz being God or Christ, as the Christ actually really is the typology. And then you have Ruth being the Gentile bride, and you have Naomi being Israel. And again, these types are sort of confirmed. Women, when they're used symbolically or in this typology in the Old and New Testament, represent a group of people in a belief system. And so when you see Vashti, for instance, representing Israel, and you see Esther representing the church, that fits. And then you see the same typology and symbology being used consistently when you get into the book of Ruth, and Naomi being a type for Israel, and Ruth being a type of the church. And that's really instructive then, because when you get into, say, the book of Revelation, and you see in chapter 17 and 18 the harlot riding the beast, you know that it's symbology and typology for a belief system representing the woman riding the beast, in which case is going to be the one world order. And so these things are consistent throughout the Bible, Old Testament to New Testament, but the real point is historical narrative has a plain meaning first, real events, real history, and all it does is it sets up the pattern, and then the types have to be consistent throughout the Bible, like we just demonstrated with the woman, and the allegory has to be consistent with what it's patterning. And a lot of times that's where you get the prophetic insight or confirmation of your understanding of prophecy, is you can see that prophecy basically confirmed by a proper use of types and allegories from the historical narratives in the Old Testament. And I've done a bunch of videos where I just go back and I confirm that that's the understanding. An example would be Enoch was raptured before Noah and his family were protected through the flood or the devastation, and Enoch being an example of the church being raptured before the remnant of the Jews being protected through the believing Jews being protected through the devastation being, what we see in Revelation, I think it's 12, where the Jews are told to flee to the mountains. Many people say Petra, where they're protected for 3.5 years while the tribulation period is going on. And so there you can confirm your understanding, let's say, of prophecy by seeing that the allegory and the pattern was set up in the Old Testament already. So that's how those work, and I hope that's clear. And you'll find tons of allegories appropriately done on top of historical narratives in the Old Testament. If you ask me, that's just a huge miracle of, it confirms that this is the Holy Spirit writing this book from beginning to end, because how do you have something so amazing as type and allegory sitting in the Old Testament that confirm, future events as prophecy? So that's just amazing. Now let me go to the sticky one that, when you see people interpret these, I think it sort of opens up the Pandora box for people to come up with all sorts of other interpretations that really don't fit what the Bible's trying to say. Now let me show you what's going on here. These aren't super prevalent, but they're pretty prominent in the Old Testament. And so I'm going to point to a couple of them just to get you to know that they're sitting there, but don't let it open up the Pandora's box for you, okay? The first type of allegory sitting on top of historical narratives is the most common. These are very specific and a lot more rare in the Old Testament. So Isaiah 14 is definitely prophetic. Now listen to some of this language. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which doth waken the nations? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. But thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake the kingdoms? Now, I'll just stop it right there. I think you can see. This happens when heavenly perspective is being recounted, that you sort of get this, how do you want to say it? It sounds like an allegorical kind of set of languages. So we've got how you've fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, cut to the ground. And then you get this prideful statement. Now this, of course, most everybody would assume is, the fall of Satan and the reign down below here of the Antichrist. For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars, I will sit upon the mount of the congregation. Well, there's 5 I wills, I think, in here, and it's very famous, and that's the pride that was the cause of Satan's fall. So you see the heavenly context, and yet you have this, and they shall see narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble? And so now it becomes very tangible as you leave the heavenly realm and you get down to a verse that talks about earth, and the following ones here, we talk about the nations, so we're talking about earth. It becomes more tangible. And so what you get here is, you got to see in here the interplay between the heavenly consideration of Satan and why he fell, and the information we're being given in sort of a heavenly, you want to say symbolic kind of a way, but it's when it talks, when it brings it down to earth, if you want to say, it becomes way more pragmatic. And then we see down here thou cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and a raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as carcasses are trodden under the feet. And so there you get more, again, tangible facts, but again, it gets a little, I'd say almost metaphorical when it's speaking about this outcome in hell for what happens to, what many would say is the Antichrist. So you see how this one is complicated. Now, if people try and see this kind of language all throughout the book of Revelation, for instance, you can come up with, I think, strained interpretations because you're looking for this kind of combination of heavenly and earthly visioning stuff in the book of Revelation, and you're coming up with then interpretations that might be considered private interpretations. But that isn't to say that there isn't metaphorical language being used, for instance, in the book of Revelation or other places in the Bible, and that's what makes understanding prophecy, there's theologians, and I try to, you guys know that watch my videos, I try to follow a lot of the teaching from theologians that specialize in eschatology or end times, because this is trickier stuff. And you don't want to just go off and say, oh, I think it's this. There's still rules that apply. These hermeneutics still apply. And you have to put those down first. And it has to be consistent with all the hermeneutics until you can start saying then that there's an interpretation here that may be symbolic or include allegory. Okay, so there's the trick. Now here's another one, Ezekiel 31. I just did a video on this one. The forest through the trees. Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, fair in branches, with shadowing shroud, and a high stature, and his top was among the thick boughs. Now, if you do a study in the Old Testament, yes, there is a country called Assyria, and yes, there was a king of Assyria, but we're getting a label and a usage that is symbolic. And how do you pick that out? Is the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon. Well, that's directly now setting up the metaphor. How does a person be a tree? It's metaphorical language. And so now you have to consistently apply, the interpretation of the symbol or the metaphor that's used throughout the scripture. You can't say the Assyrian really, was, pick something goofy like the Assyrian really wasn't an Assyrian. He really was, President Obama, and he was a cedar in Lebanon, and go off and start making up what this means to you. You have to actually go see how was the Assyrian used throughout the Old Testament, and then how were trees likened to that person, and then you start come up with the interpretation. So these few uses here are the really tricky ones, and don't just let it open up a door that any symbolic or metaphoric language in the Bible can have any definition it wants. Symbols always are used consistently in the Bible. So the first thing you should do is, you can go look up, there's tables of cross-reference what symbols mean in the Bible. If you get a good one, you'll find these things and how they're applied in the Bible. So consistently apply your symbols and understand your metaphors to then start getting to your interpretation, because otherwise you'll quickly go off into the weeds. Here's another one in Ezekiel 28. It starts by talking about the Prince of Tyrus, or Tyre if you don't use the King James. But a little bit later down here, see if I can, it's still talking about the prince of Tyre, but then you get in verse 13, thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the jasper, and the like. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth. Well, there really was a king of Tyre, and the story does play out where God sent judgment upon the king of Tyre and his nation, and he was prideful and lifted up. But again, in a metaphorical sense, now God is saying that he was in Eden, the garden of God, and that he was the anointed cherub that covereth, meaning the head cherub, which we know was Satan's role. And so, to properly interpret this passage, you have to know then how that metaphor was set up, and you can't say, well, this must be the king of Tyre went back in time and somehow was in the garden of God and escaped the garden of God and showed up. You can't start just making things up. You have to apply the metaphors consistently. You have to interpret the passage the way it was written. So I shy away from these passages sometimes because there are, let's be honest, there are multiple interpretations of some of these passages, even from theologians. Although if you really study it out, you won't see huge variation like you do in just us common folk that try and interpret these Bible passages. We're all over the place when we go through these passages, and theologians, for the most part, stay bound pretty close to common interpretations in these type of passages. And then in the historical narrative ones, I think there's so many of them. You just got to get somebody that's really good with their knowledge of the Bible that can apply these appropriately. And feel free to challenge if you don't see on these historical narrative ones, if you don't see that allegory as being correct or setting a pattern, there's very good chance somebody misapplied the allegory. But why I like these is there's a plain meaning of the text, and the actual events set up the allegory where you have the types and the symbols. And so I guess my coaching is just going to be, when you run into passages, first double, triple, quadruple check, are you on a historical narrative, which the answer is almost going to always be yes. Now, if it's using symbolic language or whatever, first interpret the symbols consistently with the rest of the Bible, and then you'll probably have a historical narrative that makes a lot more sense. For instance, in the book of Revelation, it really cleans up your understanding if you just do that first step, consistently apply the definition of those symbols to their actual uses, stars being messengers or angels from God, right? Do that first, then read the text as historical narrative. And then if the base text has meaning, that's the primary meaning. There could be a secondary meaning, like we see on here, that it's setting up a pattern or an allegory, but it doesn't negate the primary meaning. It doesn't mean the actual events didn't happen. And one other little heads up I give, when we had the video series, the playlist on understanding prophecy, is prophecy generally was written as a historical narrative in advance. Now you get a couple of little twists and turns with near-far prophecy and with what's called the church age gap, which I think exists 24 times in the Bible or something like that. But in general, it flows forward in a progressive way. And so prophecy is, historical narrative written in advance. And that's coming from me. I didn't actually have a theologian. I didn't read that from a theologian. It's just I've been in these passages, the prophetic ones, so much that plays out to be true. So use that as a rule of thumb from a brother and not from a theologian, okay? But that really helps, I think, navigate you through these passages. So that's what I got for today, and thanks for watching. I'll probably add this video to the Understanding Prophecy playlist.